In 1408, a couple exchanged wedding vows inside a stone church on the southwest coast of Greenland. Guests witnessed. A priest officiated. The ceremony was recorded in church documents. And then an entire civilization went silent. No letters, no ships, no distress signals, just nothing. For 500 years, roughly 2,500 Norse settlers had carved farms into frozen fjords, built churches, traded walrus ivory across Europe. Then the written record simply stops. When explorers finally returned centuries later, they found empty buildings, overgrown pastures, no bodies stacked in doorways, no signs of battle. The colony hadn't been conquered, it hadn't burned, it had just ceased to exist. But the most unsettling part wasn't the silence, it was what scientists pulled from the mud 3 feet beneath a dried-up lake, evidence that the land itself had turned against them. The story begins with a lie. Around 985 CE, Erik the Red, freshly exiled from Iceland for murder, sailed west and found a massive glacier-choked island. He named it Greenland, a marketing trick. He needed settlers, and settlers needed hope. Within a decade, shiploads of Norse families arrived, establishing 2 clusters of farms along the southwestern fjords. The eastern settlement, closer to the southern tip, and the western settlement farther up the coast. They brought cattle, sheep, goats. They cleared scrub willow and birch to build longhouses. For a while it worked. The medieval warm period kept temperatures just mild enough for short growing seasons. The fjords offered seals, and deep in the northern hunting grounds, they found their real currency, walrus. Walrus ivory was medieval Europe's white gold. Before African elephant tusks flooded the market, Norse Greenland supplied carved crucifixes, chess pieces, luxury goods to cathedrals and courts from Bergen to Rome. A 2020 study out of the University of Cambridge confirmed that Norse Greenland's entire economic survival hinged on this single commodity, walrus tusks harvested from increasingly remote waters. The population peaked near 2,500, spread thin across hundreds of scattered farms, and that number matters. This wasn't a sprawling empire. This was a fragile thread of human habitation stretched across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. National Geographic's synthesis of decades of archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of what came next. Researchers found that the Norse overgrazed their livestock, stripped the fjords of their limited trees, and systematically undermined the thin topsoil their entire farming system depended on. By the late 1300s, the western settlement was empty. Archaeologists found abandoned farms with doors still closed, animal bones scattered in barns. Whatever happened, it happened faster than anyone planned for. But here's where the standard narrative cracks. Because the eastern settlement, the larger, more established colony, held on for another 50 to 70 years. Same climate, same geography, same isolation. So if cold and starvation killed the western settlement, why did the eastern settlement survive decades longer? Something else was happening. Something the bones wouldn't reveal for another 600 years. For decades, the dominant theory was simple. The Little Ice Age froze them out. Temperatures dropped. Sea ice expanded. Trade ships couldn't reach them. They starved. Case closed. Except the timeline doesn't fit. Iceland endured the same Little Ice Age. Iceland suffered famines, volcanic eruptions, plague. Iceland nearly collapsed multiple times. But Iceland survived. Norse Greenland, with its seal-rich waters, its centuries of adaptation, did not. The cold alone can't explain that. Then isotope analysis of Norse skeletons began telling a different story. Researchers studying bone chemistry found a profound dietary shift across generations. The settlers had pivoted from eating terrestrial animals like cattle and sheep to consuming marine resources, especially seals. This wasn't preference. This was desperation. Their farms were failing, and they were eating the sea to survive. And in 2023, a study published in Science revealed something no one expected. By analyzing deuterium content in leaf wax preserved in lake sediments, researchers found that southern Greenland's climate didn't just get colder, it got drier, progressively, relentlessly drier across the entire Norse period. Their livestock needed water, their hay needed rain, and the rain was vanishing. Drought in Greenland, the cruelest irony imaginable, surrounded by ice, dying of thirst. Meanwhile, the walrus ivory trade was collapsing. African elephant ivory had entered European markets, and suddenly Greenland's most valuable export was worthless. The Cambridge research confirmed it. Overexploitation of walrus populations had already made hunts longer, more dangerous, pulling able-bodied workers away from food production during the very years when food production was failing. Every pillar was crumbling simultaneously: the soil, the rain, the trade, the livestock, the isolation. And yet, one detail remained unexplained. The eastern settlements' farms weren't just on failing land, they were sinking. In March 2023, a peer-reviewed study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences delivered a finding that reframed the entire collapse. Researchers measuring ancient shoreline markers discovered that during the Norse occupation, local sea levels in southwest Greenland rose by up to 3.3 meters. Not globally, locally. The southern Greenland ice sheet had advanced, warping the crust, pushing sea levels higher along the very coastline where Norse farms clustered. 3.3 meters. That's not an abstraction. That's shoreline retreat of hundreds of meters. Pastures that existed when Erik the Red's settlers first broke ground were underwater by the time the last family shuttered their doors. The farms didn't fail because the people failed. The ground beneath them was being swallowed by the sea. And this is what makes the Norse Greenland collapse unlike any other medieval disappearance. It wasn't one catastrophe. It was 5, arriving in sequence, each compounding the last. The overgrazing stripped the soil. The drying climate starved the livestock. The ivory market collapsed. The sea ice isolated them from Europe. And then the ocean itself rose to claim the land they'd spent 5 centuries defending. No written chronicle survives from those final years, no desperate letters, no last diary entries. The 1408 wedding at Hvalsey Church, that's it. That's the final transmission from an entire civilization. After that, silence so total that when Danish missionaries arrived in the 1720s, they found only ruins and Inuit communities who had no memory of the Norse at all. The most haunting question isn't why they vanished. The evidence now makes that brutally clear. The question is what happened to the people. Did they die in their farmhouses as the fjords flooded? Did some board ships and attempt the crossing back to Iceland or Norway? Ships that never arrived. Archaeologists proposed 2 hypotheses. The entire population perished in Greenland, or they migrated. But no wave of Greenlandic Norse refugees appears in Icelandic or Scandinavian records. No ships logged, no names registered. 2,500 people, gone. Not conquered, not burned, just absorbed into the silence of a landscape that had spent 5 centuries trying to kill them and finally succeeded. And here is what stays with you. The last physical evidence of Norse Greenland isn't a grave or a weapon. It's a church. Stone walls still standing in an empty fjord. A building made for gathering, with no one left to gather. The fjords are still there. The ruins are still standing. And somewhere beneath the lake, mud and rising tides, the full story of those final years remains locked in sediment no one has tested yet. Next time, we open a file on a city that was erased from every map and the people who still live there.